What's up, Detroit Lions fans? Good afternoon to all of you. I hope your day is going great because today we've got another major update involving the future of this team and details that could directly impact next season. So make sure to show your support on the video because what's happening in Detroit is starting to get the attention of the entire NFL. And you need to see this right now because the Detroit Lions may have just walked into one of the most dangerous situations of the entire 2026 NFL season, and the more details that continue to come out about this schedule, the more you start to understand why so many fans are frustrated right now. Because this is not only about playing an international game in Germany, this is about everything that comes after it, and according to comments from team president Rod Wood, it sounds like the organization already knew exactly what they were getting themselves into weeks before the schedule officially dropped. The moment Detroit was connected to Germany, everybody immediately knew why. This was always going to happen eventually because of Amon-Ra St. Brown. His popularity continues to grow not only in Detroit but internationally as well. The NFL understands that, they understand the marketing value, they understand the connection with Germany, and they understand that the Lions have become one of the biggest attractions in football over the last few seasons. So from the league's perspective, this matchup made perfect sense. But what fans are reacting to now is the timing and the bye-week situation surrounding that game. Rod Wood admitted the organization already knew about the Germany matchup weeks before Thanksgiving, and the Lions apparently hoped they would receive a longer break after that stretch instead of dealing with another brutal turnaround scenario. Instead of getting relief before Thanksgiving, Detroit now has to battle through an exhausting stretch of games before finally receiving that mini bye afterward. And that changes everything when you think about the physical toll this could take on the roster, because this is not a normal road trip. You are talking about traveling internationally, dealing with jet lag, changing time zones, recovering physically, and then immediately trying to get back into NFL rhythm against some of the toughest competition on the schedule. Fans understand how difficult that can become over the course of a long season, especially for a team that already expects to be competing for the #1 seed in the NFC. And honestly, this is where some frustration toward Rod Wood is starting to build among the fan base. Not because Detroit is going to Germany, most people expected that already. The frustration comes from the idea that maybe the organization underestimated how dangerous this scheduling situation could become for the players physically. Quick turnaround games are brutal enough already inside the United States. Add international travel into that mix, and suddenly recovery becomes a major concern. Still, despite all the complaints about the schedule, one thing became crystal clear after the betting lines were released. Vegas absolutely believes in the Detroit Lions. And not just a little bit, the Lions are currently favored in 14 of their 17 scheduled games entering the season. Think about how insane that sounds for a franchise that spent decades being viewed as one of the NFL's biggest underdogs. Now the expectation across the league is completely different. Detroit is no longer the team trying to prove they belong. They are now the team everybody else is chasing. The only games where the Lions are currently underdogs are on the road against the Buffalo Bills, the Chicago Bears, and the Green Bay Packers. And even those spreads are relatively small. Buffalo is only favored by 3 points, Chicago by 1.5, Green Bay by 2.5. That tells you sportsbooks believe Detroit can realistically win every single one of those games. And honestly, when you look at this roster, it is hard to argue against it. Detroit has become one of the most complete teams in football. Jared Goff continues to play efficient football. The offensive line remains one of the best units in the NFL. The defense is expected to improve again, especially if the pass rush finally takes another step forward. Kirby Joseph continues developing into one of the most important defensive players on this roster, and the Lions are no longer walking into games hoping they can compete. They expect to control games. One of the most shocking lines so far might be Week 1, where Detroit opens as a 7-point favorite. That is a massive amount of respect for Dan Campbell's team, but then you start looking deeper into the schedule and things get even crazier. The Lions are 9.5-point favorites at Ford Field against the New York Jets. 9.5. That is not a small spread in the NFL. That is Vegas basically saying Detroit should dominate that matchup completely. Part of that comes from uncertainty surrounding the Jets' quarterback situation, but another part comes from the belief that Detroit's offense could absolutely explode in games like this. And there are other matchups where Detroit is heavily respected too. They are favored against the Panthers, favored against Arizona, favored at home against Green Bay, favored against Minnesota, favored against Miami, favored against Tampa Bay, favored against against Atlanta, favored against New York again later in the year. Everywhere you look, sportsbooks continue placing Detroit in control. That is the biggest sign of all that expectations have officially changed around this franchise. But there is also pressure attached to that, because now every single opponent is going to treat the Lions like one of the NFL's elite teams. Nobody is sleeping on Detroit anymore. Nobody is overlooking them anymore. Every matchup becomes a statement game when you are favored almost every week of the season. And maybe the most interesting part of all this is Buffalo. Even though the Lions are underdogs in that matchup, there is a growing feeling that Detroit could absolutely win that game. It happens early enough in the season where weather probably will not become a major factor. The coaching staff should still have the roster healthy. And these games between Detroit and Buffalo have been competitive recently. The Bills have won, but they have not blown Detroit off the field. The Lions have been right there, so now the conversation completely changes. This is no longer about whether Detroit can compete with the best teams anymore. The conversation is whether they can survive the schedule, handle the pressure, stay healthy through the international travel chaos, and finally turn all this expectation into a deep playoff run. Because when Vegas says you are favored in 14 out of 17 games, they are telling the entire football world one thing very clearly: the Detroit Lions are expected to be a Super Bowl contender. But with the Germany trip, the difficult scheduling stretches, the division battles late in the season, and the growing pressure surrounding this team, do you think the Lions can actually handle those expectations and finish as one of the NFL's top teams this year? And the scary part for the rest of the NFL is that Detroit still feels like a team that has another level they can reach. That is what makes these betting lines so fascinating right now. Vegas is not treating the Lions like a lucky playoff team anymore. They are treating them like one of the true heavyweights in football, and when you start breaking down some of these matchups individually, you begin to understand why expectations are becoming massive around this organization. Take the division games for example. Even though Detroit is favored in most of them, none of these NFC North matchups are going to be easy. The Packers continue playing the Lions tough no matter where the game is played. It does not matter if it is at Ford Field or Lambeau Field. Those games always feel physical, emotional, and extremely close. That is why seeing Green Bay favored by only 2.5 at home late in the year is not shocking at all. Cold weather, road environment, playoff intensity, all of that matters in December football. But what is interesting is that Detroit is no longer entering those games intimidated. A few years ago, Lions fans used to look at trips to Green Bay or Chicago and immediately assume disaster was coming. That mindset is gone now. Dan Campbell completely changed the culture of this franchise. The Lions practice outside. They prepare for physical football. Jared Goff has already proven he can win in difficult conditions, even if critics continue bringing up the cold weather narrative every single season. This is not the old Detroit anymore. And maybe that is why sportsbooks continue leaning toward the Lions despite how difficult the schedule actually looks on paper. Even the matchup against the Chicago Bears feels different now. Yes, the Bears are expected to improve. Yes, that roster has talent, but Detroit is still viewed as the more complete football team. The Lions are still viewed as the standard inside the division until somebody proves otherwise on the field. Then you look at some of the non-division games and things become even more interesting. The Miami Dolphins matchup is one that immediately stands out because of the environment. Miami late in the season is never easy, especially with the heat and humidity, but Detroit is still favored there by 6.5 points. That is a huge statement about how much confidence people have in this roster right now. Even in difficult travel situations, even in uncomfortable environments, the expectation is still that Detroit should win. The same thing applies to the Arizona Cardinals game. There is already a belief that Arizona could struggle heavily because of how brutal their schedule is projected to be. And when sportsbooks look at that matchup compared to Detroit's roster, they clearly see a major gap between the two teams. The Lions are expected to control games like that if they truly are one of the elite teams in football. But there was one specific betting line that really caught attention: the Giants game. Detroit being favored by 5.5 sounds reasonable at first, but there are already people questioning whether that spread might actually be too high. Not because the Lions are weak, but because some believe New York could become a sneaky, dangerous team, depending on how their young players develop throughout the year. There is also growing curiosity about Jackson Dart and what impact he could potentially have if he sees the field. Add in younger offensive talent and an improving coaching situation, and suddenly that matchup may not be as simple as people think. Still, the bigger picture remains the same. Detroit is expected to win almost every single week. That kind of pressure can either elevate a team or completely destroy it, and this is where leadership inside the locker room becomes critical, because the Lions are no longer playing with the emotional advantage of being doubted. That underdog identity fueled this franchise for years. Now they have to learn how to handle being the hunted team every single Sunday. Everybody is going to bring their best shot against Detroit now. Every fan base wants to beat them. Every defense wants to shut down Jared Goff. Every opposing coach wants to prove they can outsmart Dan Campbell. Every nationally televised game becomes bigger because the Lions are finally viewed as one of the NFL's premier attractions. That changes the mental side of football completely. But there is another reason why fans should still feel confident despite the difficult schedule and the international complications. This roster genuinely feels deeper than previous years. The defensive line is expected to improve. The secondary has more confidence. The offense already has chemistry. And unlike previous seasons, Detroit now enters the year with legitimate expectations of competing for the NFC's top seed again. That is not media hype anymore. That is the standard inside the building. And honestly, one of the most overlooked parts of this entire conversation might be timing. That Buffalo game early in the season could tell us everything about who these Lions really are. Because if Detroit walks into Buffalo and wins that game, the entire league is going to start viewing them differently immediately. Suddenly, all the conversations about the Germany schedule, the difficult travel stretches, and the tough division games become secondary. At that point, people are going to start seriously asking whether this could finally be the year Detroit reaches the Super Bowl. Oh, especially because these matchups against the Bills have been competitive already. The Lions have not looked overwhelmed against Buffalo. They have been right there, a couple plays here or there, and those games could have gone differently. Now, imagine Detroit with an improved defense. Imagine the defensive line finally creating more consistent pressure. Imagine Kirby Joseph continuing to evolve into one of the best ball-hawking safeties in football. Imagine the offense maintaining its explosive identity while the defense finally catches up. That is why expectations are exploding right now, because people around the NFL are starting to realize this team may not have reached its ceiling yet.